Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 24th of October 2011, the podcast that cranks it up to 11 and pulls off the knob. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's dropkick the news of the bogus. If you're convicted of a misdemeanor in Bay Minette, Alabama, you now have a choice. You can serve time in jail and pay a fine, or go to church every Sunday for a year. Yes, you heard that right. Jail or church. According to CBS News, people convicted of a misdemeanor offense will have the option of being released as long as they attend worship services and check in with the pastor and the police every week. Folks, you don't need me to tell you what's wrong with this. Just read the First Amendment. The government has no business compelling criminal offenders to partake in any kind of religious ceremony, but what they're saying here is, in effect, go to church or go to jail. Police Chief Mike Rowland was idiotic enough to say that this could have a positive effect on the lives of people currently heading towards a life of crime. Nah, there's no religious bigotry here. Why, listen to what ABC's Good Morning America had to say about the issue.
If you ask, does it work? To a great extent, I think it does. I mean, if you were, as a friend of mine likes to say, if you were out at night, in the middle of the night, and you had a gang of teenagers behind you coming closer and closer, would you or would you not feel better to know they just come from Bible study class?
Well, that would kind of depend on what part of the Bible they were studying. Were they studying Genesis 34, where a group of men forcibly circumcise and then kill all the men in a town just because one of them slept with their sister? Or 2 Chronicles 15, which says that anyone who doesn't worship the Lord of Israel should be put to death? Or Deuteronomy 13, which says you must completely destroy an entire town, including livestock, if even one person in the town worships another god. Personally, I'd feel a lot better if they'd just come from a physics lecture, or a speech by Richard Dawkins, or a performance of Julia Sweeney's one-woman show, Letting Go of God.
What choice do you have if you're an atheist?
Well, remember, there is a church for atheists now, too. It may not be in that town,
Maybe not
but there is a church
right.
for atheists.
I'm just gonna let that one go. Sometimes it's just too easy.
I think community service can be thrown in there as an option.
But community service already is an option for a lot of misdemeanors. So why do we need this new rule? Why don't we just stick with that, community service? Currently, 56 churches are participating, but it's unknown what a church would have to do in order to qualify. Will temples or mosques be able to participate? What about the Unitarians? Or the Scientologists? Or the Raelians? Once again, the government is being put in a position of saying which religions are valid and which ones aren't. Religion should be none of the government's business, and the last thing the government should be doing is telling people either go to church or you'll be put in jail. Do people really need to be told this? If you're pulled over by a state trooper for a minor traffic offense, what do you expect to happen? Well, you have to show him your license and registration, and he writes you a ticket. Does he get to search your car? Unless he arrests you, of course he doesn't. But what about your cell phone? Well, a California appellate court ruling allows police officers to download the entire contents of your cell phone in a traffic stop. Yes, all your emails and texts, everyone you called or who called you, and your high score on Angry Birds would all be made available to them. It started back in 2009 when Reed Natoli was pulled over for speeding by Deputy Sheriff Stephen Ryan. Even though Ryan said that Natoli was not driving erratically and wasn't arrested for driving under the influence, he nonetheless suspected that Natoli was under the influence of drugs. He then searched Natoli's vehicle, finding a perfectly legal Glock 20 and a BlackBerry Curve which had a picture of a man in a mask holding 2 rifles. So Ryan and another deputy went through the entire contents of Natoli's BlackBerry and used that as an excuse to raid Natoli's home. Natoli's lawyers argued that this violated the Fourth Amendment, but the ruling judge, Franklin Elia, decreed that the contents of a cell phone are part of a normal inventory check and are the same as an open cardboard box. He also ruled that police get to search the cell phone contents for their own safety. What possible threat could the contents of a cell phone pose to the police? He also wrote, quote, "The deputies had unqualified authority to search the passenger compartment of the vehicle and any container found therein, including Reed's cell phone. it is up to the U.S. Supreme Court to impose any greater limits on officers' authority to search incident to an arrest. Hopefully, the Supreme Court will take this case and smack it down like the unconstitutional invasion of privacy that it is. But unfortunately, as we've seen, judges are just politicians in robes. Unfortunately, that just isn't a future that we can depend upon. In yet another invasion of a citizen's privacy, Google has complied with the demands of the U.S. government to hand over the personal information of a U.S. citizen without a warrant. Jacob Appelbaum is a developer for Wikileaks, and the government went after his information using the grossly misnamed Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which was passed in 1986 and allows the government to demand user information from ISPs without a warrant. In fact, Google claims to have received over 4,600 requests for user data from the U.S. government just in the last half of 2010, and has complied with 94% of them. This is the information of citizens like you and me, who have not been charged with or accused of any crimes, nor has any establishment of probable cause been required. But if that weren't scary enough, the fact that this happened with a developer of WikiLeaks strongly suggests that the government is using these tactics to silence brave individuals who are trying to expose their corrupt and tyrannical actions. That makes it not only a violation of our Fourth Amendment right to privacy, but also our First Amendment right to a free press. Although Google, Facebook, and Twitter have complied with these requests, two things should be pointed out. 1. They may well have faced both civil and criminal penalties if they refused, and 2. They have fought diligently for transparency to let people know that these invasions of our privacy are happening and how often. They've also been lobbying the government to reform this law. Even at the time of its passage, this law was hideously unconstitutional. Since then, the development of the World Wide Web, the ubiquity of emails, and new forms of communication such as web chat and texting have transformed this law from something that only threatens the liberties of a select few into one that threatens us all. It's up to us to hold our elected officials accountable for the damage the government does to our private lives. And now it's time to examine the brain damage of this week's biggest Bogon emitter. Susan Greenfield is a woman whose self-appointed mission is to rid the world of the scourge of violent video games. To her, no misinformation is too much. She uses scary-sounding pseudoscience to frighten people into banning these innocuous and even potentially beneficial products. She said that video games can literally blow the mind. Wait a minute. Literally blow the mind? Oh, wait, she's probably just misusing the word literally, right? Anyway, can literally blow the mind by temporarily or permanently deactivating certain nerve connections in the brain. Wait, she meant it? She was actually using literally? Yes, she wants you to believe that video games actually cause physical brain damage. But while this claim of temporarily or permanently deactivating certain nerve connections in the brain may sound scary, in reality it's what's going on in your brain all the time. In fact, the temporary or permanent removal of neural connections is essential to a properly functioning brain. Your brain constantly rewires itself based on experience. Going to school does it. Crossing the road does it. Anything you experience does it. In fact, when this process gets interrupted, like it does with certain neurological conditions such as epilepsy, bad things can happen. Gamma-aminobutyric acid, for example, is a neural inhibitor that plays a crucial role in deactivating connections in the brain, and if you don't have enough of it or it becomes ineffective, it can lead to such disorders as epilepsy, anxiety, bipolar disorder, Parkinson's, and many others. What Greenfield is presenting as a horrible consequence of video games is, in reality, just a normal and even crucial part of how our brains are supposed to work. I probably did more damage to my brain from all the face-palming I did while reading this article than I ever did from playing video games. Greenfield went on to say, quote, "The human brain has evolved to adapt to the environment. It therefore follows that if the environment is changing, it will have an impact on your brain. If you play computer games to the exclusion of other things, this will create a new environment that will have new effects." Yeah, and if you play computer games to the exclusion of other things, you'll starve to death because you're not eating. Your brain adapting to environments is a good thing. This is probably the most vital function of our brain, in fact, the ability to adapt to the unfamiliar things that happen to us. Reading a book does exactly the same thing. She went on to bleat, quote, Screen technologies cause high arousal, which in turn activates the brain system's underlying addiction and reward, resulting in the attraction of yet more screen-based activity. Let me demystify the scientific jargon here. High arousal, which in turn activates the brain system's underlying addiction and reward, is known in scientific circles as having fun. Any activity that you enjoy doing has this very same effect. The hilarious thing is that she said the solution was for people, quote, to be outside, to climb trees, and feel the grass under your feet and the sun on your face. But all of these things have the exact same effect that she was just talking about for video games. They all cause deactivation of neural pathways. They all cause your brain to adapt to the environment you're in. And if you enjoy doing them, they cause high arousal and activate the brain's reward system. Yet these things are good and video games are bad? I think you're far more likely to get brain damage from falling out of a tree than you are from an Xbox. She reaches a new low when she compares the dangers to the dangers of smoking, which were unknown in the 1950s, and tried to claim that the unknown dangers of video games should be just as alarming. This is a hideously dishonest comparison. She's comparing the direct inhalation of carcinogens to a sensory experience that causes the brain to react in no different way than any other sensory experience. This is blatant scaremongering bordering on outright fraud. Check out this claim from the article. Quote, a paper published earlier in the summer in the PLOS One journal indicated that internet addiction could rewire brain structures in the inner brain and even cause shrinkage in gray matter. Okay, first of all, how do we get from video games to internet addiction? Interesting bait and switch there. But again, this is no different from any other activity one could engage in for a long period of time. A pianist who practices for hours a day has his brain rewired in the same manner as this so-called addiction. The shrinking gray matter part is particularly scary. Unless you understand that this can also happen with conditions such as dehydration and insomnia, and it's completely reversible. Not only that, but it has not been shown to in any way impair the capacity to think or learn. And it's completely different from the kind of shrinkage observed with dementia or Alzheimer's. The rest of her arguments basically take the form of, too much video games causes physical changes in the brain. The thing is, you can replace video games with anything you want, and even take out the too much part, and it would still be just as accurate. Anything you do causes physical changes to the brain. She's just playing on people's ignorance and fears of the brain and using it for no good purpose, just to demonize her pet boogeyman, solely for the purpose of pushing her own agenda. That means that her brain has been perfectly configured to be this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now it's time to surreptitiously wiretap this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Attorney General Eric Holder has done a fine job continuing his office's long-standing tradition of warmongering with incompetence. As both the neocons and the Obamatons try to drum up yet another bogus war, this time against Iran, their so-called intelligence keeps revealing itself to be nothing of the kind. Case in point, Holder's announcement that he uncovered a terrorist plot to bomb the Saudi and Israeli embassies in the U.S. What's hilarious about this is how they were supposedly going about doing this, having the plot carried out by a member of Los Zetas, a Mexican criminal organization. The so-called mastermind behind this alleged plot was Mansour Arbabziar, a used car dealer described by those who know him as scatterbrained, and called him Jack because of his tendency to drink a lot of Jack Daniels. Not the kind of person you'd trust to lead your covert terrorist operation. This is like trying to send in Woody Allen to seduce Princess Beatrice. The Obama administration went all out to convince our allies the plot was real and called for increased economic sanctions against Iran. After all, sanctions have never ever worked before, so why interrupt a long-standing tradition of failure? And they also called for, you guessed it, military intervention. These kinds of failures are not unusual, but what's laughable about this is the speed at which the conspiracy theory unraveled. It took less than 24 hours for the Middle East Institute at Columbia University to release a statement saying what sheer bogosity this is. Quote, Iran has never conducted, or apparently even attempted, an assassination or a bombing outside the U.S., and it is difficult to believe that they would rely on a non-Islamic criminal gang to carry out this most sensitive of all possible missions. In this instance, they allegedly relied on at least one amateur and Mexican criminal drug gang that is known to be riddled with both Mexican and U.S. intelligence agents. Whatever else may be Iran's failings, they are not noted for utter disregard of the most basic intelligence tradecraft. If Iran is really as stupid and as incompetent as this case implies, then perhaps they are their own worst enemy, and not the clever and determined adversary that they are made out to be. Kenneth Katzman, Middle East analyst for the Congressional Research Office, also called them out on it. Quote, "No one high up in the Quds, the IRGC Command, the Supreme National Security Committee, or anywhere else in the Iranian chain of command would possibly trust that such a plot could be kept secret or carried out properly by the Mexican drug people. They absolutely would not trust such a thing to them, given Iran's undoubted assumption that the Mexicans are penetrated by the DEA and FBI and ATF, etc. They never, ever use such has-beens or loosely connected people for sensitive plots such as this." He also said that the idea that this bumbling Texas used car salesman was a sleeper agent for the Quds was, quote, "ridiculous." Folks, even idiocy has motivation. What is Holder and the Obama administration trying to achieve here? The Justice Department needs some big success under its belt to distract people from the scandalous Operation Fast and Furious. The Obama administration has been beating the Iran war drums from the start, and Obama himself before he was even elected president. Perhaps they were even idiotic enough to be duped by someone else making up this ridiculous story, such as factions in both Israel and Saudi Arabia who would love to see a war between the U.S. and Iran. Whatever the real truth behind this, it seems clear that, through duplicitousness or incompetence, the real motivation is to start yet another war with Iran after every previous attempt to do so has fallen flat. Like the scaremongering about Iran possibly getting a nuclear weapon, which is laughable because their program could only result in reactor-grade uranium, as evidenced both by the opening of the Bushehr 1 reactor on September 12th and the fact that their facilities can't make any significant amounts of weapons-grade material over anything like the next 1,000 years. It seems the more desperate they get, the more they reach to ridiculous levels to try and start a war. If we can take any consolation at all with this, it is that the Justice Department has been so incompetent as to make this attempt laughable and likely discredit any future scaremongering they engage in. After all, this was certainly imbecilic enough to make Eric Holder this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this exoriational edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums at Bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and participate in discussions about these subjects and anything else you'd like. And if you'd like to participate in the Bogosity podcast, you can send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@Bogosity.tv. If you put it in an MP3 file, it just might get played in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Plato. "This and no other is the root from which a tyrant springs, when he first appears as a protector." The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported license.